Okay, so friendship with God. So this is something I've been thinking about now for nearly 50 years. It'll come out differently than it did last Sunday. Because 1977, I was 19 years old, and I was put on a train. We're given a one-way ticket to Inverness in the Highlands of Scotland with some fundraising product, and told to go there and pioneer. So I had no idea where I was going, where I was going to sleep, or anything whatsoever. But there we were. I just got on the train, off I went. And at that time, I was a very, very shy person. I never used to speak to people. I would never introduce myself to anybody. I'd always hope that somebody would introduce me to somebody. In that sense, I'm very, very English. And some of you might remember me from those very old days. Where's Peter gone? Oh, there you are, Peter. Yeah, so Peter. Yeah, well, you'd ought to, because we were on the same 21-day workshop in Cleeve House in 1975. I remember you leading some singing and making an incredible impression. And but I didn't speak to anybody or talk to anybody. Anyway, so I went pioneering in Inverness, and I was supposed to be witnessing. But the most difficult thing in the entire world for me was to stand on the street and stop somebody and start talking to them. And so sometimes I'd be standing on the street for hours and hours, or I'd just end up in a complete daze and fog and confusion. And if I did get round to stopping somebody, they thought I was a bit nutty because I couldn't actually enter into intelligent, sensible conversation. And it was getting worse and worse. And then I used to pray, and I used to pray for myself. And the more I prayed for myself, then the more depressed I got. And the worse it got. And then one particular day, I thought I'd better try and have a public lecture. So I got a little hall in the sort of council building, whatever it was there. And then, I hoped that people would come along. Anyway, so nobody came. So I started giving my lecture anyway. And then the caretaker came up and said, "Oh, there aren't many people here today, are there?" Which made me completely deflated. And then I went home. Well, actually, I didn't go home because I didn't have a home. Anyway, I thought, well, nobody came. It's still a bit early. So I still had some fundraising product, this magazine called The New Tomorrow. And so I went around knocking on the doors, and nobody wanted to buy. And I ran out of anything to say. And I said to God, "Look, God, I'm just going to carry on knocking on doors, but I haven't got anything to say, so I'm not going to say anything anymore." And then I went round and went into this dark corridor and knocked on the door, and the door opened, and I didn't say anything to the person who opened the door. And he said, "Oh, would you like to come in?" So I went in and then tried to enter a conversation with me, tried to say something. Anyway, he bought a magazine. That was someone called Derek Day, who later on joined. And it's interesting, these kind of situations. Anyway, but part of the prayer then, I was just praying for myself. And then eventually I got to the point where I said to God, "God, I want to have a friend." And God said to me, if you want a friend, you have to be a friend. Oh, okay. So instead of just praying for myself, I just started praying for others instead. And the atmosphere around me started to change, and I started to become, I guess, a better person. But anyway, so since then I've been thinking on and off from time to time about the friendship of God. And anyway, so this is one of the most interesting things in the Bible. Because very often we emphasize about filial piety and about God is our parent. But there's also this sense which you find in the Bible, which you don't find anywhere else in any other scripture, to be honest. There's this. And I'll explain about it later. Now, Moses used to take a tent and pitch it outside the camp some distance away. I'll explain about why later. Calling it the tent of meeting. As Moses went into the tent, the pillar of cloud would come down and stay at the entrance. While the Lord spoke to Moses, the Lord would speak to Moses face to face, as one speaks to a friend. So I've always thought this is really interesting. God spoke to Moses face to face, not like parent to child, not like master to servant, but as friend face to face as a friend. So when you speak to a friend, are you speaking to someone who's higher than you, lower than you, or equal to you? Equal. It's very intense. Oh, that's really interesting. God treated Moses as his friend. And that reminds me when God created, it says, so in the principle God created human beings and he created us in his image and likeness. So why did God create us in his image and likeness? Because he wanted to have a relationship with people that were like himself. In that sense, were like equals, with whom he could share everything that he's thinking, everything he's feeling, everything he's doing. He could just share it completely with human beings. But very often we think about, we emphasize, we're the children of God. But a relationship between a parent and child is not like a relationship between friends, is it? No. Do you want your children to grow up, or you want them to stay in a state of dependency? Grow up. So you can speak to them as equals, friend to friend. And it's nothing worse that children, it really drives children nuts when their parents still treat them as if they were 6 years old, like my mother used to treat me. Anyway, it's just the way it works. And as part of that is allowing this person to get to that sort of level. So when one goes into the spiritual world, Father said, there isn't this sort of hierarchy in the spiritual world. Everyone's equal. We're all equal with each other, speaking to each other, friend to friend. So I thought that was interesting, this idea that Moses was a friend of God. Never says, oh, he was a son of God, a friend of God. And then if you look back a bit further, let's see if I can move this on, talks about Abraham being the friend of God. This is from Isaiah. But you, Israel, my servant, Jacob, who I've chosen, you're descendants of Abraham, my friend. And again, Chronicles, which is the history. Our God, did you not drive out the inhabitants of this land before your people Israel and give it forever to the descendants of Abraham, your friend? And again, in the New Testament, the scripture was fulfilled and says, Abraham believed God and is credited to him as righteousness. And he was called God's friend. You see that a person considered righteous by what they do and not by faith alone. And so again, Abraham is called the friend of God. And that's really interesting as well, because when we look at the world, most of the people in the world are the descendants of Abraham and Sarah and Hagar. Yeah, that's interesting. They're the friends of God. So they weren't. And so, when God spoke to Abraham, God never said to Abraham, the word obey doesn't exist in the Hebrew Bible anyway, but God didn't say to Abraham, you have to do what I tell you. God said to Abraham, walk before me and be blameless. Walk before me and be blameless. So God didn't say to Abraham, follow me. He said, walk before me. And to be blameless means what? It just means you follow your conscience. So God was expecting and hoping that Abraham would just take the initiative, so that he'd be blameless, he'd just follow his conscience and walk before God, and God would take an interest. Just like as a parent, you take an interest in what your children are doing. Well, that's really interesting. And you follow your children in that sense, follow them around the garden or wherever. And so have a look at the relationship between Abraham and God then. So one day, God dropped in to see Abraham, a few angels with him, and then had a little conversation, discussion, and then this whole question of Sodom and Gomorrah came up. Then Abraham approached God and approached the Lord and said, will you sweep away the righteous with the wicked? In other words, you're planning to destroy and wipe out Sodom and Gomorrah because they're such a corrupt and wicked society. Will you sweep away the righteous, the good people, along with all the wicked people? What if there were 50 righteous people in the city? Will you really sweep it away and not spare the place for the sake of 50 righteous people in it? Far be it from you to do such a thing, to kill the righteous with the wicked, treating the righteous and the wicked alike. Far be it from you. Will not the judge of all the earth do right? And the Lord said, if I find 50 righteous people in the city of Sodom, I will spare the whole place for their sake. And then Abraham then continued to negotiate with God and finally whittled it down to 10 people. But the point is here, this is you won't find this anywhere else in any other religious scripture in the entire world. Abraham says to God, what is there? Will not the judge of all the earth do right? In other words, what you're doing here, God, is wrong. And he is challenging God. He's challenging God because he said to God, what you're doing here is wrong. Won't you, the creator of the universe, the creator of the world, the judge of the world, won't you act justly? And won't you uphold justice? What you're doing here is not fair. And so do you think God was happy or unhappy that Abraham challenged him in this way? What do you think?
I think he's happy.
Happy. Why would he be happy?
Abraham's growing up.
Yeah, Abraham's growing up. He is acting as he's supposed to act, as God wanted him to act. God wanted him to be the ancestor of all humanity. So when Jews pray, they don't just talk. You know, the Christian tradition is you always look at the patriarchs. All the patriarchs are all male. Yeah, and then within Christianity, you have just priests don't get married. Jesus was just a man. Whereas within Judaism, they don't talk just about the patriarchs, they also talk about the matriarchs. So they pray for Abraham and Sarah, for Isaac and Rebekah, for Jacob and Leah and Rachel. And of course, Hagar fits in there as well. So everybody in the world who's either Jews, Christians, and Muslims are all the descendants of Abraham. So that's interesting. So God wanted Abraham and Sarah then to be like that. And so God was hoping that Abraham and Sarah would act in the right way. And he wanted them to grow up, as Peter was saying there. So it's extraordinary then, that kind of relationship with God, where you actually argue with God. It doesn't exist in any other religion. You argue with God. Anybody here argue with God? From time to time, sometimes get into a rage with God, say that's not fair, that's not right. Sometimes people become atheists because they don't argue with God; they just reject and say God doesn't exist. But it doesn't matter what happens, whether you go through hell. Just tell God about it. From your deepest of depressions, talk to God about it. I'm really depressed. Life is really tough. It's this, and this, and this. You start speaking from where you are. As the conversation goes, you start to, your original mind starts to develop. So that's the relationship that Abraham had with God. He was a friend of God and he challenged God. That's extraordinary. So let's have a look then, a bit more about what was going on here, but the relationship between God and Moses. Then the Lord said to Moses, so this is when Moses went up the mountain, Mount Sinai, and then, he fasted for 40 days and 40 nights, and then God gave him the 10 Commandments. As we know that during that time while he was fasting, the people who were down at the bottom of the mountain, they started getting worried. Where's old 80-year-old Moses gone? We haven't seen him for 40 days. There's no takeaways up there. What's he been eating and drinking? Maybe he just died. And so they asked Aaron, would you make us gods that we can worship? And so Aaron then he collected rings and gold and jewelry and things mostly from the women, I guess, and then made a golden calf. And then when this was going on, the Lord said to Moses, go down, because your people, whom you brought up out of Egypt, have become corrupt. They have been quick to turn away from what I commanded them, and they've made themselves an idol cast in the shape of a calf. They bow down to it and sacrifice to it and have said, these are your gods, Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt. I have seen these people, the Lord said to Moses, and they are a stiff-necked people. Now leave me alone so that my anger may burn against them and I may destroy them. And then I'll make you into a great nation. So God is saying to Moses, look, I agree with you. They're really annoying people. They're stiff-necked. They won't do what they're told, etc., etc., etc. I'll just wipe them out and I'll find a much better people for you who will actually do what you tell them to do. Be nice and obedient. And, what do you think Moses was thinking? You might think, yeah, actually that'd be a lot easier. For me to lead a lot of people who just do as they're told, who just follow my orders, who just follow my instructions, who don't complain, who don't disunite, but are completely united with me all the time, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It'd be much easier if I had people like that instead of these stiff-necked people. Do you think Jews are proud of being stiff-necked? Yes, they are. If they weren't stiff-necked, they wouldn't be around today. No matter what happens, they exist because they're so stiff-necked. So what did Moses say to God then? Lord, he said, why should your anger be burned against your people? So God says to Moses, they are your people and you brought them out of Egypt. And Moses says to God, why should your anger burn against your people? They're yours, whom you brought out of Egypt with great power and a mighty hand. So it's interesting. So Moses is turning the tables around on God, and he's bringing up to God and saying, actually, you're the one who's responsible. They're your people, not mine. So don't just think you can wash your hands of them. They're yours. It's intense, this conversation. So when it says that Moses spoke to God, do you want to turn off the steamer thingy, Bob? Turn it down or something. Otherwise, there won't be any hot water for coffee later. And you can see, so when it says that God spoke to Moses face to face, you can see how intense this relationship was. God said this, and Moses turned the tables around and said exactly the same back to him. That's Moses and God speaking to each other face to face. There's none of this, oh yes, God, you're completely right. I better do what you tell me to do. Not at all. It's an incredibly intense relationship, and Moses really cared about the people, even though they're really a pain in the neck, and he really cared about God. And then Moses says to God, why should the Egyptians say, it was with an evil intent that he brought them out, to kill them in the mountains, to wipe them off the face of the earth? In other words, just think about what they'll write about you in the Egyptian newspapers, that you're not a good God, you're a bad God, and you're going to create for yourself a bad reputation. So don't do it. If you care about your face, what do you call it? Face, something. Save your face. Don't create this kind of impression upon everybody. Turn away from your fierce anger, relent, and do not bring disaster on your people. Remember your servants Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, to whom you swore by your own self, I'll make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky, and I'll give your descendants all this land I promised them, and I will be their inheritance forever. The Lord relented and did not bring on his people the disaster he had threatened. Again, Moses is reminding God, look, God, you made some promises. You have to keep your promises. It's can you imagine talking to God like that? Do you think anybody ever spoke to true parents like that? No. That's a problem. Yeah? That's a problem. This is how one should speak to God. This is how people should speak to true parents, in the same way. Not thinking, I have to be obedient and filial piety. No, face to face it should be. And so that's why we have Judaism, Christianity, Islam, because Abraham and Moses spoke to God face to face, and God was always present there. And if you look at another conversation, so as I said, Moses then, after this conversation with God, then Moses went and parked it, set up his tent outside the main camp where everybody else was. Then the Lord said to Moses, Moses, leave this place, you and the people you brought up out of Egypt, and go up to the land I promised on oath. I'm not going to break my promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, saying, I will give it to your descendants. But I'll send an angel before you. Go up to the land flowing with milk and honey, but I will not go with you, because you are a stiff-necked people, and I might destroy you on the way. And when the people heard these distressing words, they began to mourn, and no one put on any ornaments. So God said to Moses, okay, look, this is the deal then. They're stiff-necked, they're difficult to deal with, so I'm not going to go and be with them. I'll just send an angel along to guide them, to take them there. So when the people heard that God wasn't going to be present with them, they were deeply hurt and upset, and they mourned, and they wouldn't, put on their nice clothes or anything. They were so unhappy, the whole idea that God wasn't going to be present with them, and God wasn't going to go up with them into Canaan. And so Moses went and spoke to God about this and said to God, look, if your presence does not go up with us, do not send us up from here. How will anyone know that you're pleased with me and with your people unless you go with us? What else will distinguish me and your people from all the other people on the face of the earth? And the Lord said to Moses, I'll do the very thing you've asked, because I'm pleased with you and I know you by name. So God had a plan, but it wasn't working out. So Moses negotiated with God. We have to find something that's going to work. The problem with God has many problems. One of God's problems is too idealistic. If you remember, God thought Moses can lead the people out of slavery in Egypt into Canaan, the promised land, in how many days? 21 days. Do you think it's possible to go through the necessary psychological, social, political, economic changes within 21 days to go from a state of being a slave society, and everyone thought of themselves as slaves, to being able and capable of living in a free society in 21 days? Is that possible? No. Anybody here did a 21-day workshop? Yeah. I mean, how much better were we after that 21-day workshop? And so it became delayed. Okay, that's not going to work. Let's make it 21 months. And so 21 months then to go from Egypt to the promised land. And they sent the 12 spies out. And that didn't work out either. And so I thought, okay, it's going to have to delay this a bit more. And it became 40 years. So they spent 40 years living in the desert. And as God said, all the people who grew up in slavery in Egypt, the people with the slave mentality, they will die. Because it's very hard to go through the necessary psychological and social changes to live in a different kind of society and create a different kind of society. So all the people who were born in the desert and grew up in the desert, they were living in a free society where they just had to observe the law, keep the law, not be obedient, just to keep the law. And then what was the first commandment? I think I mentioned this a few times. What was the first commandment God gave to the people when they came out of Egypt? Anybody remember? When they were complaining that they was hungry, then God sent them food to eat. And when they had food to eat, God said, okay, I'm going to send you food, manna, for 6 days. On the 6th day, you're to collect twice as much, and on the 7th day, you're not to go out and collect manna. So on the 7th day, you're to observe the Sabbath, which means you're to sit inside in your tents, sing together, pray together. Couldn't do 100K, but anyway, do something together, play games together, have fun together, and be there as a family. Because God's original ideal from the very beginning was God wanted to create God-centered families, not one family. God wanted to dwell and live in every single family. That's why in the pledge you talk about the 4 great realms of heart, the 3 great kingships, etc., etc. It's all the idea that God wanted to dwell in a family. But in order for God to dwell in a family, the family has to exist. That means it has to be in the same place, at the same time, on a regular basis. And so that's why you should work for 6 days, because work is good. But on the 7th day, no one is to go to work. Instead, you're all going to spend time together as a family. Eating together, singing together, dancing together, having fun together, playing games together, telling stories together. All these different things. And then through this, then, the tradition was passed on from generation to generation. And so Jews have a saying, they say the Jews kept the Sabbath, and the Sabbath kept the Jews. So despite everything that happened, the temple was never the focus, the synagogue's still not the focus. The focus has always been the family. All the festivals, Passover, all these things are all family-based. And they turn up at the synagogue, for other things, but it's very much family-based. And that was the original ideal. And so that's what God tried to start off. But it wasn't working because the people yet weren't ready to do that yet. And so God negotiated and said, okay, I'm not going to go up with you. Moses said, well, that's not going to work. The people aren't happy. They want to be led by an angel. They want you to be present, just as you are present on the Sabbath. When they sit together and they pray together and they eat together and they have fun together, then you are there in that family. In every single tent, you are present. So the negotiation was, okay, it's got 12 tribes, various things. Okay, what you can do then is you can build a tabernacle. Okay, so this is one way to get the people united together, working together. They can build a tabernacle. And then that's where I'll be present there in the tabernacle. So that's okay, that works. Then they can feel that you're present, and it's not just as an angel, but you're there present. But that was never plan A, was never to build a tabernacle. It was never a plan to build a temple. That was not the plan. The plan was always God to dwell in the family. And they weren't ready yet because they'd just been slaves in Egypt. So they needed to get into that learn these kind of things. And that was the purpose of the tabernacle, the purpose of having a rabbi to teach them. But the whole purpose is not to build a temple. It was to have God-centered families all over the world. Not the idea that God would dwell in any single building anywhere, because God wanted to dwell in people's home. Yeah. I learned a bit of this from my mother. My mother's really old. She couldn't do very much. What she enjoyed more than anything else was just sitting on the settee, as well as watching Wimbledon, just having her grandchildren around. That was it. She just wanted to sit there and be present when I was around, my wife was around, and the children were around, etc. And she was happy. I think, that's what God wants. Just wants to be around, wants to be present in the family. Anyway, so that's what happened here. And, so it says here, I'm pleased with you, I know you by name. So it's always nice to know somebody by name. So as a teacher, it's always really important to get to know the names of every single child in the classroom. Children want to be known by name. Even when I was a supply teacher, obviously I'd arrive in a school and I wouldn't know anybody there, so I had to take the register. As I took the register, I had a little map of the classroom. I wrote everybody's name when they said yes on this little piece of paper I had in the right desk. And so when they asked a question or something, I would speak to them using their name. Oh, how do you know our names? Well, I'm a teacher. And for me, this has always been important. And so whenever I teach workshops, I always get to know everybody's name. Nowadays, my brain doesn't work as well. It takes me a while for the name to come back, but I never forget people's faces. Because, God wants to speak to... Moses spoke to God face to face, and we should also speak to each other face to face. Yeah. And this is always really important. Otherwise, you're out. Challenge and leadership. Anyway, another thing. I'm probably talking for too long as usual. Chris asked me not to talk too long. Let's see. Anyway, there's another little thing. Again, they got upset with Moses. If only we had meat to eat. We remember the fish we ate in Egypt for free. Yeah, nice free socialism. And the cucumbers, the melons, the leeks, the onions, and the garlic. My goodness. And as for the miraculous bread from heaven, in other words, you send us McDonald's every single day for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. We're getting sick of it. Although it has sustained them, it has ceased to satisfy them. Now our appetite is gone, nothing to look at but this manna. Anyway. And so again, Moses went to God about this. Why have you brought this trouble on your servant? What have I done to displease you? You put the burden of these people on me. Did I conceive all these people? Did I give them birth? Why do you tell me to carry them in my arms as a nurse carries an infant to the land you promised on oath for their ancestors? If this is how you're going to treat me, please go ahead and kill me, if I have found favor in your eyes, and do not let me face my own ruin. Again, an incredibly intense relationship and conversation that Moses has with God over and over again. But at the end of the day, the greatest leader in human history was Moses. Because what they created 3,500 years ago, this Jewish society and community, it still exists today. You look anywhere in the world, you don't find anything like that. Yeah, so that's interesting, they got it right. The problem when we teach the principle often, we fail, 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 but actually we ignore the 99% of the things they got right, which is why they're still around today. And so, yeah, I think this is important. And then when we look at, so Moses was struggling a lot. And so God said to Moses, gather for me 70 of the elders of Israel. I'll take some of the spirit that is on you and put it on them. And they shall bear the burden of the people along with you. So you will not bear it all by yourself. And so this is really important. Moses felt he was just alone, leading alone. But God said it doesn't work. And one of the interesting things, when God created Adam first, and Adam was doing this, that, and the other, doing the gardening, and God said, it is not good for man to be alone. It's not good for man to be alone. And so what did God create? Created the animals first. And Adam went around naming all the animals. But eventually, Adam realized, I can have all these pets, but still I want someone different. And so then God created Eve. And then Adam was happy. Yeah, it's not good to be alone. And so when Moses came out of Egypt, he was alone, leading the people. And Jethro came up to him and said, it's not good to be alone. You need to delegate. You need to have a team. And that's really important. And so I feel incredibly grateful. I got a team, I got Chris, and the people on the council doing this, that, and the other, because I'm really lazy. I'm not very good at doing things, but they do so many different things, and Peter, the newsletter and everything. And it's really helpful, actually, to have a team of people that you're working together with, and it's really important. And I can see that's very much the way that Mike Balcom works as well, as a team. And this team, then, are friends. And so this is Jesus. My command is this, love each other as I've loved you. Greater love has no man than this. He lays down his life for one's friends. You are my friends if you do what I command. I no longer call you servants, because a servant doesn't know his master's business. Instead, I've called you friends. For everything I have learned from my Father, I've made known to you. And so again, Jesus didn't call his disciples. He didn't call them followers. He didn't call them servants. He called them friends. They just went out and they went fishing together. They had parties together. They did stuff together. They were his friends. And so he expected and hoped that as friends, they would just take responsibility. They would take the initiative. And so after the crucifixion and resurrection, the 12 disciples, they traveled all over the place, just not waiting to be told what to do. They just did it. They just followed their original mind, their conscience, just as God had said to Abraham, walk before me and be blameless. Just take the initiative. Don't wait around, wait to be told what it is that you should be doing. And so I like these kind of ideas, and this idea of the friendship of God. I think it's really nice. We don't talk about this in our own spiritual community very much, because we're Confucianists. It's just relationships between father and son, and within the family. But this idea of friendship is something really precious, I think. And it's very rare for God to call someone their friend, to speak to them face to face. And the only place you find this intense conversation between God and another human being, whether it's Abraham or Moses or Isaiah or many of the other prophets, you only find that in the Hebrew Bible. There's nothing like this in the New Testament. There's nothing like this in Christian scripture. There's nothing like this, unfortunately, in true parents' words either, about the intensity of that relationship. So I find this really interesting to look at these kind of conversations that God has with other human beings who he calls his friends, not just his children. And, whether you like it or not, we're all children of God anyway. That's just the way it is. But not everybody gets to the point where they can speak to God face to face, and God treats them as a friend. And I think that's something nice to aspire to think, okay, I want to have that kind of relationship with God that Abraham had and Moses had and the prophets had, to speak to God and to relate to God face to face. So, thank you very much. And I hope there's something there to think about, to pray about.